I'm going to be telling folk tales and history stories. So I wanted to ask someone, if maybe some of the younger people first, do you know the difference between a folk tale and history? Okay, Red. Um,
Fine. A folk tale is a story, and history is a historical thing.
okay, now they're
That
both
something that really happened.
right, right. That's it. Because they're both stories. But a folk tale has been gone through centuries and centuries and it can be changed. And so can history. But I will be telling one folk tale to get us started, and then we're going into history. Now, today, this morning, uh, something happened I was not expecting, and I was doing my spiritual practice and got a text from my sister. And that's why I am dedicating this entire series to my cousin George Glenn, who died today. And for all of the millions, and he didn't die from COVID, but he had a long illness. But it made me, when I got that notification, it made me aware and reminded me of the millions of people who have died in this past year due to COVID and violence. And violence is part of Black history, unfortunately. And so I'm dedicating this whole series to the people who've died in this past year prematurely, for us to keep them in our minds and memories. Because there's an African saying that says a person is never really dead as long as they're remembered. And we should remember all of these people. And again, reminder, we are recording. If you don't want your face seen, you can just take your video off. And we're getting started. Imagine that we are sitting in a circle outside in an African village. And it's a warm night, not hot, but warm. And you're sitting beneath this beautiful, clear, black star-filled sky with your family and your friends. And now we begin, and I am drawing the circle with this rattle, creating the sacred storytelling circle. Because storytelling art creates revelations of enlightening delight. So it is said that in, in a Western African village, everyone was happy and they got along, except for the chief. He was one of those chiefs who had to let everyone know all of the time that he was in control. So everyone did whatever he asked, except for one elder woman. She was a grandmother. She was well respected in the village, and she was fearless. And the chief was kind of afraid of her, but he wouldn't let anyone know that. Now, this village was located on a marsh filled with frogs. And one night, everyone was sleeping soundly and happily, listening, well, not listening, but knowing and hearing their frogs, which they've slept through and slept with all their lives. But for some reason, this morning, this night, the frogs woke the chief up. And he got out of his bed, went outside, and said, I order you to be quiet. Ribbit, 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 ribbit. The frogs weren't paying him any attention. He said again, if you don't listen to me, you're going to get in trouble. Ribbit, 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 ribbit. I am in charge. I order you to be quiet. ribbit, 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 ribbit. And so it went the whole night. That chief standing up there trying to tell the frogs to be quiet, and the frogs, of course, weren't paying him any mind. Just before sunset, the chief went to the middle of the village, beat on a big drum. People ran out of their homes, and the chief said, "Get your machetes, your sticks, whatever you have, and go to the marsh and kill every single frog." And the people looked at him. He couldn't mean that. And they just stood there. And the chief said, "Didn't you hear me?" And everybody ran away to do what he ordered. And nobody was happy. But that elder grandmother walked straight up to him, looked him
Okay,
straight
that sounds great. Thank you
in
so much.
the eyes and said, "All things are connected." And he looked down at her. "Go away, old lady. You can't do anything." Well, that night, the only person in the village who slept soundly was the chief because everyone had gotten used to the sound of the frogs and they missed him. But after a while, people adjusted and they were sleeping and living well until they started to hear another sound. And it was zzz, zzz, zzz. And people started to see more and more mosquitoes because the frogs ate mosquitoes, but they were all gone. And people were making more protection, doing the best they could, but they started biting their babies, and people were upset until one day the chief got up and walked out into the village and he didn't see anybody. And he thought, well, maybe he was up early. But he walked looking in the usual places where he saw people, where they carved and gathered. There was not a single person in the village. And all he could hear was zzz, zzz, zzz. And finally, he thought and understood what that elder grandmother had told him. All things are connected. And that is a folk tale. And now we are going to go back 3,000 years ago to Egypt to learn about the one black female pharaoh. 3,000 years ago in Egypt, and Egypt was like it is now, a sandy desert country, except for that Nile that flows through it and yearly will flood so that people could plant foods. And in the 18th dynasty, they were ruled by Tutmos I. Now, Tutmos had been a man of common ancestry. He wasn't royalty, but he became a military leader and gained lots of influence and power and the love of the royal woman who was black named Amose Nefertari. So her husband became the pharaoh, but she was in charge of the temples and guiding the divine practitioners of the Karnak temple, which was an important temple at that time. She was the high priestess with the title of God's wife of Amun. And Amun was the most important god. So it is said that the Egyptian god Amun Re entered into the body of Tutmos I. And when he and his wife Amose Nefertari got together to make a child, it was actually the god Amun Re who was the father of their daughter. And their daughter was born 3,000 years ago. And they named her Hatshepsut, which means first among noble women. And after her birth from the god, it is said that she was nursed by goddesses. Now, some people say it might not be true, but it's come down in history, and it came down through the paintings and drawings and sculptures in their buildings. Hatshepsut grew up being educated by her mother and trained to serve as Amun Re's wife. Now, this was a name in terms of they would learn spiritual practices, they would help the clergy during rituals, and they would sing and dance at festivals. And this is how what she grew up learning the important things, the spiritual things that guided the Egyptian culture. Now, she had many brothers, but they all died. And so, because she was a descendant of the divine Amun Re, she became queen. And she wasn't happy with just being queen, even though she took the name Queen Ma'at Kare when she was 20, because the only male left in the family, the son of one of her brothers, was just much too young to rule. So she assumed the throne as the pharaoh, and she told people that the god Amun foretold her being a pharaoh. An oracle before this good God magnificently predicted for me kingship of the two lands, with the north and the south fearing me. And it gave me all the foreign lands, illuminating the victories of my majesty. So, with this prophecy, no man would argue or try to take the power from Queen Ma'at Kare. She was appointed by the god Amun Re, and he was considered the creator and redeemer, the king of all the Egyptian gods. So that gave her an in power, which was important because the Egyptians had never had a female pharaoh. The pharaohs had descended from Osiris and all the male gods, but there weren't any men. She had been anointed by Amen Ra. She was smart. She knew the rituals, and she assumed power as the fifth ruler of the 18th dynasty. And to ensure she stayed in power, she had her daughter, Nefertari, marry the young son who would eventually get the throne. But the reason she really kept power was she was a good ruler. She kept her people prosperous. She expanded her territories. She brought things from all parts of Africa. She brought in ivory and gold and ebony. And when she would travel, she'd go out like a pharaoh with troops, heralds, fan bearers, grooms, leopards, all taking long journeys throughout Africa. And they even traveled as far as the Mediterranean, to the Red Sea, all kinds of places. And she brought in turquoise and many precious items: myrrh, frankincense, ebony, gold, and ivory. And she even had ships that were 70 feet long, manned by 210 sailors with 30 people rowing them. Now, this is 3,000 years ago, before anything mechanical or technological. And they were traveling and they went to the land of Punt, which is now East Africa. And they got frankincense trees, which they dug up, the roots, the trees, and the soil, and carried them all the way back in those ships to Egypt. And that's the first time any plants or trees were successfully taken from one land and replanted in another land. And that was done by Queen Ma'at Kare. She ruled as the pharaoh for 22 years. And she dressed as a pharaoh, not as a beautiful woman, but she wore their hats, their tunics, their jackets, and conducted herself as a pharaoh in the tradition. She also built buildings, many, many, many buildings. And what did she build? Temples and tombs, which was the tradition in Egypt. She built, she was the second most builder of buildings in Egypt in history, other than Ramses the Great. And he had built more buildings 300 years earlier than her. One of her most unique buildings is called the Deir el Bari. Now, I know we've seen the pyramids. We all know about the pyramids, but this was different. It's a three-story building that is horizontal and long, and it's a big tourist site in Egypt. And you can actually look it up online on YouTube because and it's beautiful. It's big, beautiful carvings, ways to go in it, and many people looking at it. And it's right there in the middle of the desert. But it was so impressive that kings who followed her and pharaohs who followed her built their tombs in the same area, and it's been called become known as the Valley of the Kings. So the only thing and the main thing that happened to make Queen Ma'at Ka Re sad was the death of her daughter Nerure. She died, and that left the queen without a direct person to follow her because she had wanted her daughter to follow her rather than the husband, but he was the one who took power after she left. And she had a second disappointment. Building all those beautiful and great buildings was not actually done by the queen. She had someone who designed them and oversaw the building. And his name was Senenmut. He was the head architect, head builder. And she was happy with him because he did lots of good work. But after a while, it went to his head, and he decided he was going to build a few tombs extra just for himself. But when the queen found out about that, he lost his job and his name was removed from all those buildings he had no business building. But the temple at Deir el Bari remained in use for many centuries for festivals and rituals. And women for hundreds of years, for generations, named their daughters Hatshepsut after the queen. She is known as one of the greatest pharaohs of ancient Egypt, and she reigned peacefully and died when she was 50 years old. And there weren't many more female pharaohs. And as history goes, you can find different stories about her. And actually, for a while, people didn't even know about her because the man who took over, assumed rule after she died, which has happened to many rulers in Egypt and other countries, where they don't like the person who was ahead of them, they destroy their statues and try and remove them from history. But she was found and remains Egypt's one Black female pharaoh. Now, are there any questions or discussions or observations that you have about Queen Ma'at Kare? Okay, now we're going to go to West Africa, the country that is now known as Nigeria. And we're going speeding through time from 1,000 years BC, before the birth of Christ, to now 1,500 years after. So actually, we're going 2,000 years. There was a country there called Zazao, and it was ruled by Bakwa of Turunku. And he was a good ruler, and he was a wealthy man. He had become the ruler because he had been a successful trader in cloth, salt, horses, metals. And he had a peaceful reign. In 1533, he gave birth to a girl named Amina. And she had a younger brother and a younger sister. Amina, even though her father's rule was peaceful and everybody was prosperous and happy, they did have an army. And for some reason, Amina liked the army. And her father allowed her to go out with the military and get military skills. So she learned to fight, to ride a horse, to use a sword, and participated with the military, becoming an important leader in the military. And that's how she ended up being the queen. Her father died in 1566, and the crown was given to her brother, Karama. But Karama only lived 10 more years. And by that time, everyone knew Amina was a fierce warrior, and she had earned the respect of the whole military. Now, the country was called Zazao when she was born, but her mother changed the name of the country to Zaria after Amina's younger sister. After her brother's death, Amina was able to take control of the country and be a leader because this group of people, the Hausa, allowed women to assume leadership. In fact, women were able to put a man out of a position of authority if he wasn't doing what he was supposed to do. Now, Zaria was located in the center of three major routes of Northern Africa. And that was part of the problem they had with tension and enemies. And their main enemy was the Sangay people, who, when Amina came into power, the Sangay were stronger than her people, the Hausa. But Amina was a fighter, and she kept Zaria free for the 34 years she was in leadership. And the only way she was able to do that was they kept fighting. She kept fighting and expanding their territory and fighting and expanding their territory. She led the first military charge just a few months after assuming her power. And she continued to lead 20,000 men. as they got more land and got rid of people who were not Hausa in their cities. She made the Hausa nation strong and respected. And not only was she good with fighting, she was good with trading and getting the things that the country needed. She got wealth with gold and slaves and crops, and her people were metal workers. They were very talented. They could make many things with metals. And so she taught them how to have metal armor, iron helmets, and chainmail, which gave them an advantage over the Sangye and other of their enemies. But one of the most important things that she did was created strong earthen walls around cities for protection. The Hausa had never had walls before. Their cities would sometimes sprawl around out to endless places with no demarcation of where one place began or one ended, and there was no protection from enemies or people trying to invade. And one day, Amina got this idea because the people were had been making clay items for years, cups, dishes, carvings, and she knew the strength of it. So they created what came to be known as Ganuar Amina, Amina's walls. And they're beautiful. And they're still used in Hausa. And they were used for protection, they were used to define the city, and they were used to show how wealthy and powerful a leader was. Because the bigger the walls, that meant they had dedicated workers who were devoted to them, who worked hard. And that remains today. You could go into Hausa and see some of those walls still standing. Now, Amina was a dedicated warrior. It said she never married. Instead, she would take temporary husbands from the prisoners of war. Some said also that she cut their heads off, but I don't know about that. But that's again history, some things you never know. And the legend says that she died in battle. And people said about her, Amina, a woman as capable as a man. And she has a statue in Lagos, Nigeria, which is the capital of Nigeria, in front of there. It's a huge theater. And she's on a horse with a sword in her hand. And she's known by all the people in Nigeria. And I didn't know this, but if you've seen, have you seen the Xena, the warrior princess? She was created based on Queen Amina's life. So there was this cultural crossover there, creative crossover over of a real queen's life used to create a fictional character. Are there any questions? Quiet, quiet. Yes, and
Oh, I'm sorry. It's actually winter.
oh, oh, I'm sorry.
There's maybe two of Anne's.
Yeah.
I think that's cool how, because I remember watching Xena, but I think that's an appropriation piece, like, right? Because that's our Black history that's been appropriated to be able to be solicited for Western entertainment.
Thank you. And that's not uncommon if we look at the roots of a lot of things that have been created. And not only just from us, but from other cultures too. And this is why Storytelling is important, and this is also why we have to watch our stories, because even though history is supposed to be a record of what truly happened, there's an African proverb that explains what can happen with history. You can tell a story, the hunter will tell you one story of how he hunted and captured the lion. The lion will tell another story of how he escaped from the hunter or devoured the hunter. So when you're looking at history, and when I was looking at history, and I have to say, I am telling my interpretation of these stories based on what I found on the internet. I haven't done deep stories, deep study. But even looking on the internet, there were contradictions in some of the information, particularly regarding this next person I'm going to talk about, which is Queen Nozinga. We're still on the west coast of Africa, and we're going south, not too far south, to the land that is now known as Angola. And in 1583, it was made up of different groups of people who had city states. And at that time, there was a ruler of the lands Ndogo and Matambo, and he was called the Angola Kilianji. And in 1583, he and his wife had a daughter, and they named her Nozinga. And she was named after the Mbunda word Kijinja, which means to twist, because when Nozinga was born, her umbilical cord was twisted around her neck. And they said that that meant she would be a proud and haughty woman. Good characteristics for a leader. Now, her father, the king Angola Kilianji, he allowed Nozinga and her brother, named Ngola Mbandi, to learn about governance by being with their father. They witnessed him at work, which included guerrilla raids against the Portuguese invaders who were trying to get deep into their territory. Because as children, they grew up seeing their father fight the Portuguese, seeing how the Portuguese were coming into their country, trying to take their people to be slaves, trying to take their resources. She understood firsthand their threat and why her father worked to keep them out of their country. But even though their father was a powerful and strong leader, he was also a mean and oppressive person. So oppressive, he lost not only the support of his followers, his people, but also the support of his family. So that his own son overthrew his father, killed him, and took control of the country. But Mbandi, he was just as power hungry as his dad because he killed Nzinga's son to make sure no one would take power from him. But Nzinga stayed in the kingdom. She didn't have anywhere to go. Meanwhile, while Nzinga and Mbandi, they were having their changes, the Portuguese had built a town called Luanda from which they shipped slaves. And in 1622, they got tired of fighting the Mabunda because they'd been fighting them for a long time. So the Portuguese extended an invitation for a peace treaty. Angola was still the king, but he didn't want to talk to the Portuguese because he didn't understand Portuguese. And Zinga did. She had studied Portuguese, speaking and writing from the missionaries who came into the country. So she went in 1622 to Luanda to meet with the governor, and his name was Corio de Sousa. Nzinga entered this huge hall. On the sides were soldiers standing. In the middle of the room was the governor seated in a chair. And a few feet away from him was a carpet on the floor. No chair anywhere for Nzinga to sit on. She didn't say a word. She just turned, looked at one of her servants, and a woman or a man came on that sat knelt on that little rug, and Nzinga gently but regally sat on her back and conducted the negotiations as an equal. Now, some people say that she caved in to the Portuguese because she allowed them to baptize her as a Catholic. She took the name Donna Ana de Souza in honor of the governor's wife, who became her godmother. And when she returned home, she told her brother to have everyone convert. And it wasn't so much that she believed in the religion, but she knew she had to be able to work with the Portuguese for a little bit of time anyway. And this actually served her well and the country well because in 1623, the Portuguese made her the governor of their country of Ngogo. So even though her brother remained the king, she had a position of authority. But the Portuguese couldn't be trusted. They violated the treaty. They continued to invade the country. And it was too much for the brother. He couldn't stop it. So some say her brother committed suicide. Some say she poisoned him. What we do know is he died in 1626 and she assumed leadership. And this was a really brave and audacious thing for her to do because the Mabunda, they didn't play women leadership. What should have happened, according to their tradition, was that when one leader left, they had a hierarchy of different people in different positions of leadership who were supposed to be able to negotiate and get into ways of power. But Nzinga was able to prevent that from happening. One, because she was the governor of representing the Portuguese. She had that little bit of power, and she was known within the community for her power. But she vowed she was not going to let the Portuguese make any more inroads. So, what did she do? She made her enemies her friends. There was a group of warriors called the Jaga Warriors. They were Africans, but they were enemies originally of the Mabunda people. But they, unlike the Mabunda people, they allowed women to have positions of power. A woman could be a political leader and a warrior, and they were called Timbanza, one of those. And so Nzinga approached them as a Tambanza. And to seal the deal, she entered into a relationship with one of their leaders who was called Kaza. So that was the first relationship she built to help protect her people. The second one was she got into an alliance with the Dutch, who, even though they were slave traders and Europeans, they were enemies of the Portuguese. So these two alliances helped her to protect Ndigo for a few years, but only a few years. Because after a bit of time, the Portuguese defeated the Dutch. And with that defeat, Nzinga had to leave the home where she had been raised, and she went to another area that her father had ruled called Matamba. And she entered Matamba and took control of Matamba with the help of the Jaga. Matamba had been ruled by her father, then ruled by her brother, then left alone, and they had a weak queen. So Nzinga went in there and made herself at home, assuming power and control. But before you knew it, somehow she and her Kaza must have had an argument because the Jaga turned on Nzinga and attempted to invade Matamba. But Nzinga remained triumphant there, keeping Matamba for the Mabunda people, protecting it from the Portuguese. What she continued to do was to recruit men to help protect Mabundu. She recruited Africans who were in the Portuguese army and made them spies. And after they had gotten their information, they joined her army to fight the Portuguese. And she helped many who had been caught to escape the slave catchers or to find refuge within Matamba from the slave catchers. And so that was the army she was able to build, an army of African men resisting being put into slavery. And for 30 years, she protected Matamba and her people from being subject to Portuguese slavery or rule. Now, there's some historians who point out that Nzinga herself sold some of her prisoners into slavery. But another historian pointed out that those that she sold into slavery were people who had, in fact, been selling other Africans into slavery. And so, since she was opposed to that and she caught some Africans who were doing it, she said, okay, you get a taste of what you've been doing to our people. But by and large, she is known as being an active opponent to slavery. She, unlike some West African leaders, did not build up wealth for her country by selling slaves. She protected those who wanted to not go to, from getting caught. She built up an army more than once. She earned the respect and love of her people because not only did she have a strong army, she increased the wealth of her country with trade. And she led her people the same way that these other queens had, not by taking on the same energy and abilities that a male leader would have. She, even though she did have a child, but she went into battle herself and she led battles. She attained power when she was 40. She was still leading her troops in battle in her 60s. And she wore male dress and led her people into one victory after another. But finally, she's kind of started to get tired of fighting. And at the age of 74, she entered peace treaty talks with the Portuguese. That took some talking, but she was able to retain her power and to protect her people. And even though she had entered negotiations and claimed peace with the Portuguese, she knew the Portuguese couldn't be trusted. They were still in the whole surrounding area. So she continued to support guerrilla attacks on the Portuguese. And those guerrilla attacks continued for 300 years until Angola achieved its freedom, complete freedom, in 1975. But they started, and it was Nozinga, a woman, who planted that seed for freedom in Angola. So she died peacefully on December 17th, 1663, and she was 82 years old. Now, that was a woman who lived a life and showed what a woman can do. She is acknowledged as one of the greatest military strategists against the Portuguese in Africa because she knew how to negotiate, she knew how to collaborate, she knew how to inspire her people, even though the Mabunda did not particularly like having a woman leader. And she also has a statue of her in Angola. So all of these women have been recognized and commemorated physically in statues or buildings. But how many of them did you ever hear about any of these women when you were in school? I didn't. In fact, I just discovered Queen Ma'at Kare because I was looking for Black queens. And there's this continuing discussion about Egypt, where there are those who say Egyptians weren't Black, but they were Black. There was a lot of intermarriage and change because of the Mediterranean. And they had an influential and lasting Black queen. And these stories are important because these are stories that are the seed from which all the other struggles that Black people have in the stories you'll be getting in the next few weeks. It's this seed of strength and commitment and dedication from Black queens, which flows through Black people because they're our ancestors. And it's important that these stories are told not for Black people and for all people. Because too many people, part of the problem with racism, and this is what's sad, I work with some women, and the boss had this opening, and she said, I want each of you to say something you like, something about Homer, one word. And one of the ladies who is from Nigeria, she said, racist. She's a Black woman from Nigeria. She's married to a white man. Part of the reason she's here. And I'm married to a white man. That's not why I'm here. I came here because I'm was a nurse. But it was kind of sad, but I know that too, and that she's having those experiences because she has a little bit of accent. She's very dark. and she's different. And for her to say that, and that's why I started when the protest started last summer, was when I started saying, well, what can I do here in Homer? And that's when I started Story Circles. And it was because of the circles that I found out about Claudia. And it was recommended, well, why don't you get in touch with the library and do something? And then that's how I got the idea. Well, Black History Month's coming up. I can tell some stories. And we should note, and again, say that I'm very happy that this is sponsored by um, the Alaska Council on the Arts, funded by the Rasmussen Foundation, which was the first grant I've gotten in Alaska, which was nice. And I'm grateful that we got the grant. Now we have 6 minutes, and I would love to open this up for anyone who has some questions or discussion or observations. Because I can talk forever, but I would like to open it up if anyone else would have anything they'd like to say. Um, at this point, yes, Amalia?
I do.
I wanted to know if you liked dragons.
Yes, you noticed that, didn't you?
Yeah, I
You-
noticed the dragon.
Yes, dragons are special. They're special spiritual beings who give you power and energy and protect you. And I had a dragon ring, but my finger, I've lost so much weight, I couldn't wear my ring. But I found that when I was reading about dragons, I said, this is good to have for a backdrop. Yes.
I just got a giant book about them.
Uh, that's good.
And there's dragon skin inside.
Okay.
And there's bells.
All right.
Well, you got special dragon.
Claudia, can I
energy.
check that book out?
I'll get back to you.
Any other questions or comments? There's Red.
Yeah, I was wondering if you were going to have a list of the characters and historical figures that you're talking about we could kind of look up on our own.
Actually, I had been thinking about that, and I had never asked Claudia, but I've been thinking about I should prepare a PDF where I can just, because I can do that, give you a list, and I might even have some links to some of the articles, but I can do that. And you will find, like I said, today, I just went online and put in the Deir El Bari. I was looking for how to pronounce it. They didn't have any pronunciation for it, so I may be totally ruining the name. But if you go on YouTube, you'll see three or four videos of that tomb, and they're really, really nice videos. And the same thing, there's lots of articles. So I will do that. And what the next week, I'm going into freedom fighters, which are women who resisted slavery in the United States. And then the third one, I've forgotten the name of it, but it's about the after slavery and the struggle continued, and women who most you don't see talked about in Black history that often. I'll be talking about them. And some of them will be Alaska Black women. That's the third week. And then the fourth week is going to be all about me. Well, actually, it is because it's my personal Black history. And I'll be telling stories about some of the Black people I've met who are more well known, or maybe not as well known, but I had the opportunity when I lived in Washington, D.C., to meet writers, published, well known Black writers. I worked for a man who was a civil rights leader in New Orleans, and I didn't know that until he died years later when I read about his death. And some of the changes I've gone through, some of the things I've experienced being a Black woman in America.